Hello, and thanks so much for tuning in to the Scaling People podcast. I'm your host, Rasika Rajagopalan, and today I am so excited to be chatting with Lars Schmidt, founder and CEO of Amplify Talent. Lars, I feel like you barely need an intro, especially for all the podcast enthusiasts out there, but I'll go ahead and give you one anyways. Lars is the ultimate community and knowledge builder through Amplify Talent, where he connects people leaders with each other to continue to exchange learnings. He is the author of Redefining HR and host of the Redefining HR podcast. Prior to his life as a founder, he led talent teams at Ticketmaster and NPR. So, especially as it relates to the hiring and recruiting space, he's been on the ground and seen it all. And so, I'm so excited to dig into all of that today. Lars, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, Braska, thanks for having me on. And I feel like that end part, like seen it all. I don't even know if anybody's seen it all at this stage. Like there's all covers a lot of ground, but I've seen a lot. And yeah, I'm sure we'll dig in a lot of things today.
You sure have. And as you know, I'm excited for every episode, but I'm particularly excited for this one because I'm such a fan of your podcast, so much so that it inspired me to create this one. And so to have you on as a guest today is such a full circle moment and should be extra fun. All right, so much to discuss. Let's get into it, especially with how tapped you are into the future of work and your own personal experience leading talent teams. I wanted to start by asking you, what do you see as the biggest shift in hiring over the last few years? And how do you see these trends further evolving as we look into the next 5 or 10 years?
Oof. I'm not even going to touch 10 years. That's so far out. 5 is even hard these days. I'll maybe go backwards first. Like I think when you look at hiring over the last, couple of years, the word that comes to mind is just volatile, right? I mean, we kind of went through this period of you're really kind of going back to COVID. COVID hits, hiring clamps down for the most part. Companies don't know what's going to happen, how this is going to unfold. Lots of recruiting teams are impacted by that. Get into 2021, we stabilized a little bit into COVID. We have vaccines. Businesses are opening up again. We're entering a ZERP period, so capital is flowing freely, and the hiring bonanza begins. And that was a period we call the Great Resignation or whatever else, and that was probably one of the best times it's ever been to be a recruiter. Right, the market was on fire. We rode that for about 12 to 18 months, and then all of a sudden it stopped. And it didn't just stop; it stopped and reversed at a rapid pace. Like I've never actually seen a shift in the market like that. That went from like hiring, contraction, freeze, right? So that was incredibly volatile, I think, for recruiters. And we're still, I think we've hit that bottom period. I think we're beginning to start to turn back up again, but it is slower, and I don't think we're going to see a period like we did in the Great Resignation. So this will kind of get into the future, kind of part of your question. The world that we're entering now is a world with generative AI and emerging agentic AI. And that is there's a couple things that I think will impact how we grow over the next couple of years. One is that we will have tools that will allow us to create an automation layer in work itself, right? And certainly that will impact recruiting, that will impact most jobs. So that's a part of how we're going to be designing work going into the future. I think we're also in an environment where this notion of blitz scaling has kind of been debunked, right? Hiring for hiring's sake, obviously with the pain we've experienced over the last couple of years with the waves of layoffs, especially in tech, I think that, we've realized that's not necessarily the way. I think as we're architecting work moving forward, we're going to have a mix of, full-time equivalents, FTEs, tools, automation, AI, fractional roles, guilds and projects, and kind of gig type workers, consultants. Like I think, I use this term kind of especially for HR leaders today, like we're the kind of the architects of the new world of work. And that means that, historically we would look at, talent planning from the lens of like FTEs, right? We're going to open this new branch. We're going to launch this new product. We need X amount of full-time employees. Now we have to think a lot differently. It's like, okay, well, this is still what we have to do. What of this can be automated? What of this do we really need the headcount in-house to be able to run on an ongoing basis? Where can we bring in experts that can help us kind of build this thing, but then it shifts to maintenance and they can roll off, right? So that I think is more of what we're going to be seeing over the next I'll say 3 years. I think beyond that, then I think the wild card is how AI develops, and I'm certainly not going to be one to predict that. But if we get to like a point where AGI, which we're getting into this next iteration of AI, which is agentic AI, AGI will be kind of the next evolution from there. If there's lots of arguments from a lot smarter people for me as to whether we will get there and how soon. But if we do, then that changes everything again.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
yeah, that's why it's hard to make those like longer horizon predictions.
Yeah, no, that's so many nuggets in there. Obviously, I want to dig into all of the AI stuff with you. But before we get into that, really appreciate the comment you made on the gig economy and a lot of this fractional work that we're going to start seeing. I definitely agree. You know, some people are worried that with AI, they're going to be reduced headcount sizes. I think that's probably going to work itself out at some point. I find like a lot of these things, they just work themselves out. People reskill, they take new jobs. But the gig economy and the fractional work is really interesting, because I do think that that's probably here to stay. And so I'm curious how you think that that becoming a growing sector, how that's going to affect the recruiting function. Like, how are recruiters' jobs going to change when maybe they are going to be hiring for maybe a more contract or fractional subset of their workforce?
Yeah, like I think, pipelining becomes a lot more important, right? The ability to nurture talent. I mean, we've been talking about this forever, right? Like talent communities, right? But 10 years ago, we were people all over the conference stages talking about the importance of talent communities when in reality, most of them are just like databases that people would kind of spam without any real intention or not, right? Like most companies have applicant databases of hundreds of thousands of candidates over time that they rarely retarget, right? They're usually just a new position comes up and you go through the transactional process of hiring again. I think in this new world where we have to build guilds, like reputation will matter,
Mm-hmm.
talent pipelines will matter, the ability to nurture talent and relationships, the ability to kind of understand what you need and kind of define skills and attributes and assess those. There's a really interesting initiative that was just kicked off by Walmart, and they were the lead in this. But there's, I think 5 or 6 other big companies, and they're working together to create a common taxonomy around, most like frontline jobs, so that you can define like what are the skills associated with the jobs. And they're doing this they're working with Burning Glass Institute to create this kind of massive, taxonomy around, I think 8 particular jobs to start, but 8 jobs that represent tens of millions of jobs in the workforce, where like now you'll have a common language around, okay, if you've done this at Nordstrom, that translates to this at Walmart. And so we know if you've done that, then that crosses over to this role. And so the ability to kind of get out of the transactional aspect of just, recruiting with a resume and a job description to a different view, I think will impact both contract resources, to your point, but also full time.
Yeah, totally. Um, Kind of going back to your point on AI, what do you think are some of the best use cases for using AI in hiring? And where do you feel like you'd tread a little bit more carefully, or you feel like maybe it's a little less proven to be of value?
I mean, I think that what I love about this current phase of AI that we're in is it's really a 10x in power for individual recruiters,
Mm.
right? So I'll set aside the tools for a moment, and every HR tech is, pitching generative AI and their tools, whether that's there or not. I mean, most do have that to some level at this point. But I think going back to the individual recruiter level, like the ability to kind of go in, meet with a hiring manager, take detailed notes on, their vision for the role, what they need, what they're looking for, what the team has, interviewing other stakeholders, and then being able to kind of run all of those notes through a generative AI platform to draft a job description and an interview plan and behavioral interview questions that probe the key things that are most important to that role. You could do that today. I can do that today,
Sure.
right? So like that is super powerful. And like, are the results, I think that with any generative AI tool, the key thing to keep in mind is like none of this is necessarily turnkey,
Hmm.
right? You're not going to kind of run that, even if you have an amazing prompt and just like cut and paste the answers, it's still going to require your experience and your intuition as an expert in that field to refine the results of that. But it's a massive time saver and, multiplier in terms of impact. So that's something I think is really exciting today. I think getting into the future, interesting use cases, one of the things that and I wrote about this a couple weeks ago. One of the things that we're still doing in recruiting is exactly the way we did recruiting 30 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
which is a resume and a job description, and humans trying to make the connection between those things. I think we're going to see in the very near future, instead of like traditional career sites, and most, I think when you start to see this, you'll have the option of both, but you'll have a traditional career site, but you'll also have an AI enabled conversational career site,
Mm.
meaning it's, I can go to this prompt and I can interact with it and it can say like, hey, upload your LinkedIn profile, upload your resume. What do you like to do? What things, what do you want to learn? What do you want to grow? What skills might you have? And so it can prompt a candidate towards, asking them things that might not be intuitive or even inferred based on a static resume,
Mm-hmm.
and then serve up personalized jobs to that individual based on, some of those will probably be in the job family, so to speak, of where they work. And like, okay, you're a software engineer, here's some software engineers we're hiring, but also here's a product manager, here's a data analyst team role on the people team, right? That you probably would have never thought of,
Mm-hmm.
but it can determine based on both your experience, your skills, and your interests where that might align. And like, we rarely factor in interests. We usually just factor in experience. If we're lucky, we factor in experience and skills.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's going to change everything. And I think in terms of the risks, to the second part of your question, look, I think any companies that are using AI to make hiring decisions, you better have your process buckled up, because
Totally.
one of the things that I think, especially because this is such a new territory for a lot of, well, for everybody, the EEOC has clearly said, and for those of you watching and listening in the US, it's the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, and basically they've said like, if you're using AI tools that are making hiring decisions, you are accountable for the outcomes of those decisions,
Mm-hmm.
not the tech, not the tools, you as the employer. So if it's determined, if somebody brings up a lawsuit and it's determined that whatever algorithm, that system and technology is using to make those hiring decisions is biased, guess who's on the hook? You as the employer. And that's a huge risk. So I think you have to you have to have all the right stakeholders involved to understand, if you're using tools to help make decisions in hiring, what is their process? You have to have your legal team really understand that. Is it legally defensible? Because if it's not, you could be in a world of hurt.
Yeah, totally. I think that's such an important point. Going back to your point on 10xing the time that recruiters have through some of these AI tools, it really automates a number of the things that they're doing. You earlier talked about how, there's going to be much more of a focus in building talent communities, nurturing. Are there other areas that you think recruiters will be spending much more time in now that some of these other processes are automated? Like what skills and focus areas do you think recruiters will be building over the next few years?
Yeah, look, skills assessment and identification, relational aspects
Mm-hmm.
of just building, again, like I mentioned before, kind of pipelines of talent, like, sourcing, uh, outreach, so many of these things are now going to be automated away
Mm-hmm.
through AI. We don't really need humans. And I don't say that from like a 100%, we will not need any sourcing capacity whatsoever. Like, you still need a human in the loop, so to speak, when you think about these tools. So there is a role, but it's going to be a different role than it had been historically or even 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that piece will definitely change. I think what it's going to allow us to do is focus on more of the high value aspects. But we got to be real about it too. Like, I think that, are we going to need the same number of recruiters? Probably not. I think we got to be honest about that. Like, I don't want to front and say that like, hey, like this is all going to be great. Like, this is going to be like a reallocation of human labor and the skills and experience. And so when you have these tools that can automate different aspects of things that humans do today, yes, it will allow humans to focus on more high value things and building relationships and ensuring that they're kind of deeply embedded in the hiring teams that they support. They understand, the organizations, they can invest in those relationships on both the hiring teams and the candidates.
Mm-hmm.
But if we have, an automation layer that's taking care of sourcing and outreach and onboarding and a lot of those things that are done by humans right now, we will be able to do that with smaller teams. So there is going to be that impact, I think, on the recruiting side as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, AI is just, as you mentioned, rapidly changing the way that everything is done, both the way talent is assessed and also the way jobs are done. And so I'm curious, what skills do you think in general across the board are going to be the most important as we look into the future with so much changing? Do you think that, historically we've done a lot of measurement around the role, around the skills required for the role? Do you think there's going to be more of a focus on aptitude and broader potential as a stronger indicator of long-term success?
Yeah, I mean, look, to me, there's two things that I often kind of point to that I think are the biggest drivers of success in this new kind of AI iteration of work that we're heading into. The most important is learning agility, right? I think the ability to skill, to reskill, to learn, to not just lean into your curiosity, but know how to feed it and make time to feed it and prioritize it, right? Like those are three separate things. Like it's one thing to be curious. It's great to be curious. Like, yeah, I'm curious. I'm sure you're curious. Like, most listeners probably are. It's another thing to kind of know what to do with that curiosity and how to feed that curiosity. So that's like a second component that requires more intentionality. And then there's a third level that really you need all three is the ability to embed not just the curiosity and how you feed the curiosity, but making time to feed the curiosity and learn. And that is a piece that I think a lot of people, you know, because our day jobs are so busy, we often make excuses to not do that. Like, oh, somebody sent me that everybody's talking about this particular report. Looks great. Oh, I'm just so busy, I can't read it. Like, oh, everybody's talking about this new podcast that went out, and there's some really provocative things that were shared in there. Oh, I'm just too busy. Like, oh, we just had our earnings report and our earnings call. I should really kind of listen to that so I understand where the business is. Oh, but I'm just so busy. It's like it's easy to not do that. It's to our detriment to not do that. It's actually to our employer's detriment for us not to do that as well, because the more we feed our curiosity, the more we understand, the more capacity we bring to our roles, which impacts our businesses as well in a positive way. So I think that's one thing that's really key. And again, getting into this new kind of AI digital enabled, like there are so many things for us to learn, and not just within our role, not just within our business, but when you look at everything around us, that's impacting humanity, the world of work, like we have to have an understanding of those things too. So that's one. The second piece I say is network equity. So, I frame network equity as the ability to intentionally build a robust network, not just of peers, but of people outside of your domain. And when you do that, and it's a bit more intentional than just kind of networking, right? Like it's, networking is a component of it, but it's broader than just that. When you have the ability when you've done that effectively, the value to that is, you are able to, I call this phrase the collective intellect. When you built that, you have a robust collective intellect that's much broader than your own. So wherever you're working, whatever you're working on, you're not just bringing the knowledge and experience you have in your head and your hands. You're bringing the knowledge experience of the network effect that you can tap into and say, well, I just got out of the meeting. My CEO asked me to do X. I've never done X. Sure, I can Google it and use Perplexity and try to figure it out. There's probably some pretty good stuff out there, but I can do that. And I know three people that have done X within the last year who I can call and say, hey, can we carve out some time? I'd love to hear about how you manage X. Did you have any issues doing it? What were the landmines that maybe were unexpected? Do you maybe have any templates you used when you did X that you'd be willing to share, right? Now, I have that. That's a superpower, right? It brings a lot more value to my role. So again, those are the two things I think are critically important: learning agility and network equity.
Yeah, so well said. How do you think companies can measure those things? Like, what's the best way to get a sense of, how a candidate demonstrates that learning agility or that curiosity, or has invested in that network building?
Yeah, I think on the learning agility piece, I mean, are you talking more on like the when making hires or
Yeah,
like internal talent?
when making hires, like if that is something that
Okay.
you think is going to be really important, perhaps companies should be measuring that. And so, what is the
Yeah.
best way to do that?
I mean, look, I think from an interview perspective, asking like, where do you learn?
Hmm.
How do you learn? open-ended questions like that, right? Like you're not being prescriptive and you really want to see where they take it. I think, I do a lot of executive recruiting, and that's a question that I often ask because I want to be curious. Like, what are your data sources? How important to you is it? How do you synthesize information? Like, I think that ability to synthesize is also critically important right now because, especially again, in the era of generative AI, there's so much content out there, an overwhelming amount of content. So the ability to separate signal from noise, find high value signal, and then synthesize that across different sources, like that's a real skill. It's kind of this notion of dot connecting. So basically, just ask them questions about how they do that, how they learn, or even give an example. You know, you're in this role. You are asked to do, pick a scenario that's maybe tangentially related to the role itself. How would you go about approaching that, right? And kind of get a sense of like, okay, well, I would hit up this network, I would read these publications, I would reach out to these people who I worked with in the past who did this thing, right? So you kind of begin to understand that question also crosses over to the network equity side, as well. I think that's harder to gauge, frankly, the network equity piece. But I think learning agility certainly is pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I'm such a big believer of the case study, especially in the world of AI, where there is a lot of information out there, and being able to really focus in on the EQ that the candidate brings, how they communicate their strategy, how they respond to the discussion and the dialogue that surfaces coming out of the presentation. I think that a case study is just such a non-starter. I know that it can be an investment in time on both ends, but I think there's such value on both ends coming out of the exercise, and whether or not the role is the right fit. So any
Yeah.
other interview questions that you think are really valuable for people teams to include in more senior level hiring?
I mean, one of my favorite interview questions to this day, and it has been for a long time, is what's the best part of your job? I I love that question because it's so simple at its core, but it's actually so revealing when responded because it allows me to understand like what is this individual's drivers?
Mm-hmm.
What are the things that are important to them? What do they really gain from work? And allows me to assess as a recruiter, does that align with what you're going to get here,
Mm-hmm.
right? And maybe that's going to illuminate something that never came up in any of the conversations we've had so far. They're like, oh, wait a minute, like that's really important to you. You're not going to have that here.
Mm,
Like, let's talk about that.
sure.
Like, is that going to be okay? Or, that's really important to you. We didn't even get into that, but actually that is aligned really well with this role. And here's why, right? So I think, again, great recruiting, you have to be mindful of both attracting and repelling. It's about like kind of creating a great fit on both ends. And so that question to me can be really revealing to just understand where somebody's kind of mindset is, what they prioritize, and are they going to find that in the role that I'm working on?
Yeah, I think that's such a great way of highlighting the importance of, fit to the particular role. Oftentimes when you're interviewing these senior level candidates, like they're super talented people. They've made a strong impact at lots of different organizations. And so at a certain level, it's, you're rather than fully grilling them on just their experience and what they've done, it's really about identifying what is it that they're looking for, and is this next role going to be able to provide them that? So I think that question does a good job of highlighting that. So on the flip side, I mean, besides the obvious that, maybe we've talked about at length, are there any red flags that you've picked up on that you kind of keep a good filter on when you're talking to candidates?
I mean, I think it depends on the role, right? I
Mm-hmm.
think every role is going to have its own red flags. I think generally speaking, um, ego is a piece that I think you have to kind of gauge, right? Like, and also understand like where you cross over from um confidence to ego.
Mm-hmm.
And I think once you've made that crossover, I mean, and I'll give more context to that. Like, if somebody feels that they don't have anything to learn, that's a red flag,
Mm-hmm.
right? If somebody feels like, well, I've seen it all, I've done it all, I know it all, I can walk in and just, I've done this, my blindfolded, blah blah blah, red flag,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because like even if you have great depth and domain experience in that area is not going to be static, right? If you're not willing to learn, if you're not willing to kind of lean into curiosity and feel that you have no room to grow
Mm-hmm.
in any way, like, that that's not gonna work. Like you're gonna hit a ceiling, and you're also going to, especially for a leadership role, you're going to role model a negative behavior to the teams you're working with. You're probably going to be difficult to work with, if you just have no curiosity and no view that you can grow whatsoever as a professional. So I think that would be something that I would view as a red flag.
Yeah, yeah, so helpful. Well, you are such a champion of everything you just shared. You are such a great network builder. You are such a learner, which I'm sure is what prompted you to start the Amplify Talent community. So, really, to wrap, I would love to pick your brain on if there's any other reasons as to why you started the community, what those reasons all were, and what has been your biggest takeaway about the field of HR and where it's heading through this group that you've brought together.
Yeah. I mean, so I kind of created the community, it wasn't like a roadmap thing where I was always like, oh, one day I mean, I built other communities, right? I've co-founded HR Open Source. We grew that to,
Hmm.
over 10,000 members in over 100 countries. So I have a lot of experience. I was on the board of the Entertainment Human Resources Network way back in the day in LA. So I have a lot of experience with the communities. I think for the Amplified Talent community specifically, the genesis of that was, after I published my last book, Redefining HR, I got a lot of feedback from readers. The book was written to kind of be a blueprint for modern HR, so to kind of compare and contrast legacy HR and modern HR. And so I got a lot of feedback from readers saying, hey, this is great. Where can I go to continue my learning and my education? And this was 2021. I would have a different answer for them today if I was asked that question. But at that time, there wasn't really anywhere that I was comfortable sending or recommending them. And so I said, well, if my mission is to build a better world of work, then this is something that I need to build. And so that's kind of how that got started. So it really was launched in May of 2021 with the first cohort, we did, which is a kind of peer learning leadership development program. And, grew into a broader community, grew into 8 cohorts over the last, 3 years. And yeah, it was an amazing experience. I've announced that I'm going to be, we're winding the community down this month as I'm, planning on transitioning back into an in-house role. But it was an amazing experience. And I think the biggest takeaway for me, honestly, is the friendships that I've made through it. I just feel so fortunate to be kind of trusted with being able to play a role in developing the next generation of people leaders and chief people officers. I've always missed mentoring. I've always missed leading teams. Amplify Talent has been a pretty lean operation. So, I had to find that elsewhere. And so for me, it was so gratifying to be trusted with the development of these leaders. And I know that there's a lot of options they could have done. And so for them to invest in this for their own development, like I took that very seriously. But I think over time, really just, the coupling of that and just the friendships that both I built and also people within the community built with each other, that's going to be the lasting impact. I mean, people have started companies together who, met through the cohorts. I mean, lasting friendships. I've heard so many stories of individuals within the community of just like the impact that it's had on not just their careers, but their lives. And so to me, that will be the legacy I will always hold on to, those feelings and the gratitude for having been able to kind of play that role in connecting others and helping kind of uplift the next generation of people leaders.
Oh, I love that. Amazing. Well, Lars, I really appreciate you taking time to come on the show. And thank you so much for sharing your experience and everything you've learned through your journey. This was an extra special treat. So until next time.
Yeah, well, Roscoe, thanks for having me on, and congrats on the podcast. It was awesome to hear that mine kind of helped inspire yours, and yours is fantastic. So I'm just excited to have this kind of full circle moment with us, and I wish you all the best as well, and keep pushing us to get better.